Hi everybody, it's Scott Church, and today I'm here to talk to you about your new camera. I'm getting the first look at this right here with you, and what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk a little bit about cameras, and we're going to talk a little bit how all cameras are exactly the same, because ultimately it doesn't matter what you're shooting with, it only matters what you shoot with it. The camera that I get to play with today is, what is this? It's a Canon SX540HS. It's a baby point and shoot. SX540HS. Powershot. Canon. Canon makes really good cameras. They always have. This is a very simple point and shoot camera. I call it a point and shoot camera because it doesn't have a lens that you can change out. The lens is built into the camera. So when you turn it on, the lens is already there, and this is the lens that you're shooting with. Now it has a zoom built into it to bring you closer and further away, but you're not actually changing the lenses. You have one lens. It zooms in, it zooms out. It's very simple. The zoom is right here by the shutter. The shutter is this button right here. So when you push that button, you take a picture. The zoom is the little wheel that goes around the shutter. So if I want to get closer, I zoom in. And if I want to move further back, I zoom out. Now it has a very wide angle lens, and it has a nice telephoto lens to it. So you can zoom out real wide and you can zoom in real close without moving you. You stand in one spot and let the camera zoom in either way for you. Now the first thing that I do whenever I pick up a new camera is I put it onto manual. There's a little wheel right behind the shutter that lets you change it. There are a lot of different things that you can do with this camera. There are a lot of different settings that you can set it on. Aperture priority, shutter priority, you can tell it, what you want it to do, or you can let it make all of the decisions for you by setting the camera on auto. Setting the camera on auto, though, really doesn't teach you how to take better pictures. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to teach you how to take better pictures. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to set the camera on manual. I'm going to control all of the settings, and I'm going to make sure that what I tell the camera to do, it does. So when I set it on manual, it means I'm taking charge of my camera. Now, this camera has a dial wheel between the shutter and the control wheel that lets you change your settings. When you initially turn the camera on, you're changing your shutter speed. Now I'm going to do close-ups of all of these so you can see it. But when you change your shutter speeds in this camera, because you're viewing the actual image on the screen instead of looking through a viewfinder, because the first thing that this camera doesn't have, that most cameras have, is it doesn't have a set viewfinder. You're not looking through anything. You're looking through just this background screen. So when you're looking through the background screen, it's basically a little television. And as you change your settings, you can see them get darker and brighter. So when you change your f-stop or you change your shutter speed, you're going to see the difference in camera. Now let's be clear about this, all right? Just like with every camera that you can control the settings, there are three different things that you can change to make your pictures better. You can change the ISO, you can change the f-stop, and you can change the shutter speed. Your ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. The higher the ISO, the more sensitive your camera is to the light that's in the room. Now, starting with your ISO, and the camera's ISO, this camera's ISO, is set with a little button right here on the back that says ISO. You push that button, and then this dial wheel, you move side to side to set your ISO. Now, this camera's ISO goes all the way down to 80, and then it goes up to 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, and 3200. All right? The higher the number, the more sensitive your camera is to light. So when you get all the way up to 3200, your camera is very, very sensitive to light. Let me show you exactly what I'm talking about. If I push the ISO button and move my ISO all the way up to 3200, and then I show you the view screen, well, everything is much brighter. Now watch that view screen get darker. Oh, maybe it doesn't. Oh, there it is. That view screen gets a lot darker at 80, right? So I'm going to change it to 100, a little brighter, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, and it's real bright there. The higher your ISO, the more sensitive your camera is to light. Now, does that mean that you should immediately turn your camera on, and if you're in a dark setting, you set it to 3200 or whatever the highest ISO your camera can shoot at? No, because if you do that, the higher the ISO, the more your pictures are going to look grainy, there's going to be more color separation, reticulation. It's gonna look like crap at a high ISO. Higher the ISO, the more your images are not gonna look that great. If I set the camera's ISO to the situation, I'm inside, so it's a little bit dark. So I'm gonna go somewhere probably between 400 and 800 for what I'm trying to shoot here. When you're inside, you need a slightly higher ISO. If I were to take this camera outside, especially on a nice bright day like today, I'm immediately going to bring the ISO all the way down to 100 or 80. Because my camera doesn't have to be very sensitive to light when we have a lot of bright light. It only has to be sensitive to light when it's a little bit darker inside like it is here today. So I'm going to set the ISO. Just to play it safe, I'm going to set it to 800 because there is no 500, there's nothing between 400 and 800 on this camera. So I'm going to set it to 800 and I'm going to play it safe. That is the only time that I am going to change my ISO again while we're shooting. The ISO, the first thing that you can change, gets set to 800 and then it's done. You don't have to worry about it again unless you go to a situation where there's a much brighter light. Okay, so that's one of the three things that I've completely eliminated. My camera's now set to 800 ISO, which is a good inside setting. If I go outside, it's going to be 100. If I'm going to be inside, it's going to be 800. That's it. Outside, inside. That's the only decision you have to make about ISO. The next thing that I'm going to change is the f-stop. Now, to change the f-stop on this camera, there's a little button right there with a plus or minus. If you push that button, well then, you're changing the f-stop. Now, just like before, the higher the f-stop you go, the darker your picture gets. This camera has a very limited range of f-stops. It only goes from f4 to f8. So you don't have a whole lot of choices. So let's keep your choices really simple. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set this camera's f-stop wide open, which is actually f3.4 when it's wide open. Now I say when it's wide open because I mean what you're actually changing when you change the f-stop is you're actually changing the size of the hole in the lens to allow in light. At f8 in this lens, it's a very small hole. At f3.4, the hole is basically the size of the lens. Now think about that the same way you'd think about water. If there's a very small hole, only a little bit of water gets through. If it's a much larger hole, a lot more water is going to pour through it if you pour water into that hole, right? Well, light works exactly the same way. When you have a very small f-stop, only a little bit of light's going to get through. But when you have a very big and wide open f-stop, a lot more light is going to be allowed into the camera. Do you understand? When you open your camera up, you're going to be allowing a lot more light. Now, just like I was talking about before with the ISO, we're in a kind of a dark room today, right? Well, obviously, in a dimly lit room like this, you're going to want to go with a lower f-stop. Now, does that mean when you go outside, you're going to want a much higher f-stop? Not necessarily. Because the other thing that's really important to learn about f-stops, and one of the most fun things that your camera can do, if you notice behind me, my background is pretty much out of focus. Now I'm in a really big room here and it goes on forever, but the way that you make that background look like that is to work with a lower f-stop. Your f-stops are like a focus ring. The higher the f-stop, the more stuff that's going to be in focus in your shot. So if I bring this camera all the way up to its highest f-stop, which is f8, well, then pretty much everything is going to be in focus. And if I open it all the way up to 3.4, well, then a lot less is going to be in focus. But one of the downfalls of a camera like this with a zoom lens is your f-stop is going to change on its own as you zoom out. When it's wide open, when it's real wide, like it is there, and I can see everything, well then I'm good at f3.4, but as you watch it zoom in, wow, it changed all the way up to f6.5 when it zoomed all the way in. So it changed itself from f3.4 to f6.5 just by zooming that lens in and out. So you have to remember that when you change your zoom, it's going to change your f-stop. But either way, my f-stop is set wide open. So when my lens is wide, I'm at f3.4. And when my lens is zoomed in, I know that I'm going to be at f6.5 because that's what this camera does. The third thing is the thing that the camera is set naturally to do the minute you start turning that wheel. You start turning that wheel and it changes your shutter speed. Your shutter speed is going to change all the time. The shutter speed is the variable that you're using because your ISO is set 800 out inside, 100 outside. Your f-stop is set at wide open, so f3.4 at the wide lens, f6.5, right? 6.5 when it's zoomed all the way out. And then you're changing your shutter speeds accordingly to make that work. And the really nice thing about this camera is you can see it all happen in the view screen as you're changing it. So as you're changing your shutter speeds up and down, you're watching your pictures get brighter and darker. And ultimately, the only thing that matters about your pictures is whether or not they look good to you. Remember that. So if you think it's bright enough, then you got what you were going for. But if you think it's too bright, then you need a higher shutter speed. If you think it's too dark, then you need a lower shutter speed. And that's it. That's the way that you change your camera to make your pictures look like your pictures. So while it seems like it's a really simple camera and it really isn't that complicated, there actually are still a lot of controls that you can have with your Canon Powershot. You can change it and make your pictures look like your pictures. The most important thing is to experiment with it and change it. Change the settings. Make it look the way that you want to do. If you want more stuff in focus, go with a higher f-stop. If you want less stuff in focus, go with a lower f-stop. If you want your pictures to be brighter, go with a lower shutter speed. If you want them to be darker, go with a higher shutter speed. Your ISO, it's a pretty simple thing. 800 for inside, 100 for outside. And that's pretty much it. That's the Canon Powershot SX540 HS. It's a really cute little camera. It's a nice starter camera. And I think that you'll really enjoy it. And I hope that you enjoyed my video.